everyone. Welcome to the NowSecure Tech Talk for June. My name is Kat Ziemer. I'm part of the product marketing team here. And if you're new to our NowSecure Tech Talks, we host these live virtual events practically every month, and they feature mobile development and security experts presenting technical how-tos, tutorials, and mobile best practices. So we're very excited for you to join us today as Andrew and Kevin here will walk you through how to build a simple mobile app with GitHub Copilot. Now, before we begin, I did want to note that this session is being recorded and will be available on demand. We will also spend the last few minutes for Q&A, so if at any point you have any comments or questions, feel free to use the Q&A or comment box below so we can address them at the end. And also at the end of the session, you will also receive a quick optional survey so we can continue to produce relevant tech talks for you. And we would greatly value your feedback. And with that, Andrew and Kevin, let's get started.
Thanks, Kat. Hey, everybody. My name is Andrew Hogue, and I'm the co-founder here at NowSecure. My background started out in development, and then I co-founded NowSecure about 14 years ago. And that really pushed me into forensics in the early days, in particular with mobile, and then into mobile security. I actually, because of the forensics work, am also an expert witness and have written 2 books on the topics of mobile security and forensics, and have 3 patents. So I'm excited to talk today about our experiences with GitHub Copilot and mobile. And Kevin, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Hello, I'm Kevin Lewis, Solutions Engineer at NowSecure. Before I came to NowSecure, I was a software engineer for over 20 years. I worked in multiple industries, including healthcare, defense, and enterprise software. Most of my previous development experience was with web applications and backend server applications. So this was my first native Android development experience as we created this simple mobile app. And I'm up first. So quick overview, we decided to write a simple hacker newsreader application. That's what we chose for our simple app that we used during this project. And I was responsible for the Android part of that. So for my setup, I used the GitHub plugin from the IntelliJ marketplace for my GitHub, for my Copilot experience. The setup and installation was really simple. Went to the plugin marketplace, chose the GitHub Copilot plugin. Once it's installed, you're prompted to sign into GitHub using your GitHub account. And at that point, Copilot is up and working. So for a first initial test, I wanted to just to see how it worked. So I did something really simple. And instantly you can see that Copilot makes some inline code suggestions. And we're able to toggle through these suggestions using the option key in the open and close bracket. This was how I preferred to use it during my project. I liked the code completion was phenomenal. And the way that it brings in the whole method for me here is really nice. The other option is a pop-out window. And the pop-out window will give you, of course, I've done it, so it's not going to work now. The pop-out window gives you multiple options. So this, you can see 5 or 6 different options like I was toggling through, but you can see them all and pick the accepted solution there. The first step in creating the project was that we created a GitHub repo for the project. So on GitHub, we created an empty repository. And I decided that I wanted to use and configure automated security assessments to run while I was developing the application. So in the GitHub workflows folder, I created a couple of YAML files. I created a static only scan. This step, I used the GitHub workflow to build my application. And then I use NowSecure to do a static assessment of the application. And I configured this to run on pushes to any of my feature branches. I also created a protected branch within my repository and required a full NowSecure dynamic and static scan to be completed and passed before I was able to merge any pull requests into my main branch. I did that in this other YAML file here. So on any type of pull request, it's going to, again, build the application, and it's going to run a NowSecure scan, doing both static and dynamic. And I wanted to be able to view those in the GitHub Advanced Security within my repository. So if I take a look at the GitHub Advanced Security, this is where I can see my scanning results from NowSecure. And even on a basic, simple application like this, there are still a lot of findings that come through. All of them in my app here are just informational findings. It calls out all the network connections that are in my application. In this case, since it's a simple application, there's only one, which is a connection to the REST endpoint that I'm using to pull the Hacker News feed. There's also an API discovery. Again, the one API that I'm using shows up here in full in my scans as well. And the final one, of course, it does call out that I am including debug code in my application as I am doing a debug build for this purpose. So we can also take a look at this in the context of the pull request. So as I mentioned, anytime a pull request was open before it could be merged, I ran the scans. So if we look at the pull request, you can see all of my commits I made to my feature branch before I created the pull request. And we can see that each of the static scans completed successfully here for each of those commits. And when I click view details, I can see here that before I merged it in, it did run a full dynamic and static scan, and that all of those, that there were no new findings found during that scan. So I was able to merge that into my main branch. So I'm going to switch now back to Android Studio, and I want to show a couple of videos of my experience using Copilot. So this first video I took while I was starting my UI framework. So I wanted to build a simple navigation frame with a bottom bar and some sample screens that I could navigate between as I was starting my application. And again, I'm very new to Kotlin and Android development, so I don't always remember all of the parameters that go into a method call. So one of the things that Copilot really helped me with was creating those parameters that I'm using. So in this case, I'm creating a favorite screen, and I just want to display the text favorite screen on it while I'm starting. And as I'm setting up my column, I'm trying to remember everything that I was that I wanted to put into it. I wanted it centered vertically. I wanted it centered horizontally. But GitHub Copilot actually completed that for me. And that made it a lot easier on me to remember is horizontal alignment or is horizontal arrangement. I didn't have to remember any of that because GitHub did it for me. And it even added the text to my screen for me. So this really sped up my UI development, especially as I was building out my stub screens. Again, remembering every parameter, every modifier that you want to send to your methods and your composed functions is difficult and takes time. And as a new developer, this would have taken me a lot longer had I not been using GitHub Copilot. And this one did even better job, completed the full function here for me. Sometimes it even caught me off guard and I paused a little bit as I was reading the code to determine if it's what I really wanted or not. And I was kind of surprised. So in this one, it got 90% of what I wanted here. All I had to do was go back and add the vertical arrangement to make it centered vertically as well. Again, a great time saver, and really impressed by the code completion method of using GitHub Copilot. And the next video I have here, this was perhaps the most impressive thing I had with Copilot for the whole project that I was working on. So in this one, I'm starting to implement a JSON class that's going to hold the data that I'm pulling back from the REST API. I looked up the spec online for the API and I got the whole JSON format, and it was fairly long. It's a lot of data. So I was going to go in and just type all of this in. But Copilot actually saved me a lot of time here. I started this one by a brief comment to give some context to what I was doing. And then as I started to implement the class, Copilot actually completed the class for me. So this is great, very context aware. And actually this is a very good representation of the JSON that I'm expecting to receive from that API. It also calls out here a highlight class that I need to hold the results of the highlight results from the search from Hacker News. So my next step was to go in and implement the highlight class that I needed to hold that. And I hadn't even gone to look up what was supposed to be in that class or anything at this point. I just went in, started typing the basic skeleton of the class, and Copilot again finished the entire class for me. I went a step further, went into the author class that I needed to create, and Copilot here was able to complete that entire class for me as well. Incredible time saver. It got the types right. It filled in default values for me where they are necessary for things like page count, read count, set default variables to be either true or false. I'm very impressed with how Copilot was able to pull all of this from the minimal context that it had in my application. And so I just want to give a quick, just show you the application that I built quick. Again, it's a very simple application. It does pull data from Hacker News feed, a basic navigation at the bottom and a scrollable list. Found GitHub Copilot very helpful throughout the whole process. It definitely sped up my development lifecycle, and it made it a lot easier for me as a new programmer with the code completion, not necessarily remembering all of the specific variables or modifiers that need to be put in place. That's all for me, Andrew. Over to you for your iOS experience.
Yeah, great, Kevin. Thanks so much. I'm going to share my screen and walk everybody through what my experience was. And there was a lot of similarities. So let me pop over here. I'm going to just take a brief moment to reflect on a few things that I experienced, that Kevin and I did, I think, which is one of the things that was, so first of all, I was very surprised. I was a brand new developer to iOS, to Swift as well. I have programmed in many different languages, so I understand the concepts, but the syntax matters. And so Copilot's ability to autocomplete was a real game changer there. One of the big things that I found out was having multiple tabs opened up made a massive difference. And GitHub has an interesting blog that talks about what it's like to work on a large language model, and the one in particular powering GitHub Copilot. And so when you open up those additional tabs, what GitHub is doing is it's taking into context everything that you have open. And so it's able to look at it and say like, okay, great. I know you're creating this kind of app. I know you got these other data structures. I know you have these different views. And so that made a tremendous difference. I had a lot of the same experiences that Kevin had. So I've chosen not to show those as part of my demo. What I'm going to show you are two things. One of them is I was lucky enough to get added to the GitHub Copilot X technical preview. And so I have the next version of the large language model. And I also have this thing called GitHub Copilot Chat. And so that's very interesting because instead of just either prompting with comments or starting to write code and having it autocomplete, which tends to be a pretty good way to do things. So if you get stuck with a comment, if you start writing the code, I found, and I think Kevin also found, that that Copilot would tend to then know where to start and do a lot better on the autocompletion. But it also wasn't perfect. And so I ran into some issues. And so I also want to show you one of those issues so that you know kind of how to think through this and basically how to use this as a Copilot. Real quickly, before I dive into that, this is my basic application. Again, very similar to Kevin's. You can click here. You can see a particular article. You can look at the different domains. If anybody's used Hacker News, right, this is very similar to what Hacker News looks like. So it pulls these things in. I did also implement a very simple search where you could come out here and search for something, or let's search for Swift data. So oh, I got to be able to spell that right. And I need to get this out of my way. Swift. Who knew this would be the hardest part of my demo? Swift data. So I've got the search functionality working as well. And it's very ugly, but it was just kind of interesting to see how far I could get as a brand new developer. Now, GitHub Xcode does not have a native Copilot plugin or extension. And so I had to take a slightly different approach. And what you're seeing here right now is, of course, Xcode. And my experience with Xcode and then using it with VS Code, so I'll pop over here real briefly, is that it is best to add new files through Xcode, because that's going to add it to your different project XML files, create the structure of it, and allow you to build and do everything like with the simulator and whatnot directly from Xcode. But once I've created those files, I then do everything else in VS Code. Now, my background is primarily command line stuff. I'm also brand new to VS Code, which made this a really interesting experience for me. But if you want to do the technical preview, you have to use VS Code. So Copilot is available for Vim or NeoVim, but if you want to use the technical preview, you have to be in VS Code. And it was actually a pretty decent experience. You can kind of see here the general data structures. Once you've installed the Copilot extension, there's a little tab here, and you can click on chat. And you can scroll through here and see that I have a whole bunch of stuff in here. How do you do VStacks? How do you do a Git flow setup? How do you install Firebase? So what I found was that this was really helpful. And my ability to ask questions and then hit this little button here and just throw the code over into my editor or simply to copy it was a real game changer. And in one of the videos I'll show you, I started using the fix command a lot. So you can come down here and say /fix. There's also like /explain, things of that sort. And so you can ask Copilot to do different things. So you can literally highlight a piece of code and say, please go fix this. So again, the workflow that I found that was most useful was open up a bunch of different tabs, create everything in Xcode, then jump over into VS Code and do my coding there. And then from there, I would go back to Xcode and I would jump between the two. It certainly is not as fluid as being in a native experience where it's all 100% built in. But I have to tell you, it was actually not really difficult at all. And if you set up your screens right, so you can just use keyboard shortcuts to jump between them, it's not very difficult. What I do want to show you though are two quick movies. Actually, real quickly, I have a very similar setup with Kevin. So I do static and dynamic scans. I found this to be a really great safety net for me. Again, not only was I new to the language, but I was also wanted to do these different security scans because I was pulling in code from Copilot. And so I ended up configuring these and have 30 different scans of my assessments, which was great because then you can just pop in here, see where things are at, and then again, check your security tab and see what issues you may need to go address. The other thing I want to point out briefly is I decided to try to chronicle this experience in a kind of unedited way, unscripted way. So I have actually 11 parts to this series, which it just takes a little time to produce the videos. But I'm posting this out on my personal website. So if you just go to andrewhogue.com, you'll see each one of these where instead of just getting a little snippet or seeing like, hey, I wrote this app in an hour and everything was perfect, I literally take you through each of the different steps. And they're sometimes 10, 20, 30-minute videos. So not that people have time to sit around and watch that, but if you really want to know what the experience is like as a developer and using these technologies, there's a much longer series out there where you could dig deeper into this. So let me take you through just two really quick demos. So this first one is kind of what Kevin mentioned was, I want Copilot to help me with boring tasks that, I don't want to write the code or I'm not exactly sure the syntax and I have to go look it up. And in this particular example, I have a function here where there's an issue with this function. So in the code right here that I have highlighted on the right, I'm creating a new story and I'm passing it in different values that came in from this Firebase call that was just above here. And the problem is as I learned, not every item in Hacker News has, for example, children or descendants or comments. And so after I loaded this up and pulled in 500 apps, my app crashed. And so down here, you'll see I write a little /fix with the highlighted code. And I basically say, hey, check this for nil. And if you find that there's default values missing, pop in a default value. So Copilot came back, provided this code, and then I clicked the little insert the code button and just formatted it, saved it. And then I popped over to, let me go back. Then I popped over to Xcode, compiled it, and everything just worked. So that's a really great thing about Copilot X or Copilot Chat is it's actually interacting kind of like a generative chat, or what we're used to seeing with like ChatGPT, but instead of hopping out to a web browser and copying your code, it already has the context of all your code. And you can see everything, and you can ask it to fix and refactor and explain different things. The other demo that I want to show you, because not everything is perfect, is I did end up getting put down a rabbit hole. And that rabbit hole actually cost me a fair amount of time. So the rabbit hole was basically, I wanted GitHub Copilot to help me create this top stories view model. I named the class wrong. And the idea was that it would pull in this information, update this array of stories, and then it would notify my view that new stories have come in. And on the left-hand side, you can actually see I asked Copilot chat how to do it. And it gives me this syntax over here of like, here's a reference database, call the children, and set things up. And that code is actually pretty much accurate, directionally accurate. What ends up popping in here is, and it looked good to me. And so I was like, okay, perfect. Was it didn't actually use a Fire store or a Firebase database. It did a Firestore. And that's a newer type of database from GitHub that from Google that they're really investing in heavily. Well, I was too new to this technology to know different. Copilot had already kind of built a lot of trust with me. So I said, this looks awesome. And I spent the better part of an hour or two over the course of a couple of days in between meetings trying to figure out why this didn't work. And so the real message here is just that you have to recognize that this is a Copilot. It's an amazing tool that you can use as a developer, but you're responsible for the code. And it may get things wrong. And so being able to take a look at these things and correcting little items is really, really important. And if things don't make sense, back up, take a look, do some research. If you have the chat function, use that, and then go from there. So that's really it. I'm gonna hit stop here just so that we can see everybody. I know we've got a few minutes left for any Q&A or questions that folks might have. But I would say in general, very, very positive experience. Kevin, any other thoughts or advice that you would give people about Copilot and using it for mobile?
The main thing I was most impressed with was the code completion method. Without even having to do the comments, I found using comments to generate code to be a little bit tedious. And I think Copilot did a great job with the code completion. I did run, the one thing I forgot to point out, when I created my YAML files for the NowSecure workflow, I did that in Android Studio, and Copilot was actually able to help me complete those YAML files as well. So it did some really nice code completion suggestions in there as well, as far as building the application and even for the NowSecure scans. You just want to make sure you check the versions. Occasionally it pulled in an older version of something in one of the jobs. So I was able to very easily update that, but overall very impressed with Copilot's ability to even help create that YAML file.
Yeah, Kevin, thanks. And obviously we have a couple next steps here that we'll go over in a second, but I would say that one of the main reasons that we wanted to focus on this particular topic is there are two things that I generally see with Copilot out there in the general, public people talking about it. One of them are just basically code snippets. And, Kevin, you gave us an example of that of like, create a function that compares two dates and times or whatever. And that's really interesting for demos. But the question is for developers, how do you use this? How effective is it? And so that's why we chose to go out and to build a mobile app from scratch. And interestingly, even though both Kevin and I have a background in development, Kevin, as a professional developer, me, that's been a long time, we were able to pull that off. And I don't think I could have pulled that off on my own without a lot more time, without Copilot. So I really like being able to show, like, how do you use this in the real world? We do have a couple of if this technology is interesting to you and you'd like to, continue the conversation, there's a couple of things that you could do. One, if you've got any questions, fire them away here and we can answer them live. But second of all, we do have a very close partnership with GitHub. And so if you are using GitHub, you're building mobile apps and you're interested in this Git workflow that we have with automatically testing your apps and potentially leveraging things like Copilot and whatnot, we do have a sign up that you can do, and we can get into a POC with you and just dive in and show this to you guys live with your particular application. So there's a QR code and a link out there for you to register. Similarly, we're just experimenting with the idea of like, hey, maybe people want to continue the conversation and do that kind of like on a Discord channel. And so Kevin and I just threw together a quick Discord channel. And if you're interested in, following up on this discussion, if you have questions or whatever, feel free to just come out there and join us. That's just kind of like a best effort for us. But in case folks find that interesting and useful, we'll be hanging out there and happy to engage with you from there. Okay, I think there are a couple of questions. Yeah.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions. And we can start at the top of the list. Any OWASP violations in the generated code so far?
Kevin, are you multitasking and like pulling up the OWASP report we have right now or not?
I can do that, absolutely. But the only thing
Okay.
that the only thing of interest that showed in my scans was that I was including debug information and debug libraries in my binary. And again, that was by design since I was in the development process. I was expecting those to show up.
Yeah, and I would say similar. I really do like the question because we focus heavily on OWASP, as you guys know. So we now have a built-in OWASP report. So we'll do our standard security scans and find things, but we have a dedicated OWASP. And Carlos, who's one of the two co-leaders of OWASP, works for us now. He was working on the MASVS nights and weekends. And just like Frida, Radare, and other tools where we've hired the folks that started those, we've hired Carlos so that he can invest in OWASP full-time. And of course, he still supports our company in other ways. But that's a really big focus for us. And so we'll double check those. And if you want to, again, jump on the Discord or connect with us on LinkedIn or whatever, we can also let you know. But I don't recall on a very, very simple app triggering any significant OWASP finding. Okay, the next one. Oh, go ahead, Kat.
Next one here. There's more coming. If you want to integrate Copilot into an existing code base, can Copilot read all the code and make recommendations?
My short answer to that is yes. I think that's absolutely no problem. I actually did that for a different project because I'm now a subscriber to Copilot. It has changed my workflow, not just with like writing this app as a demo app, but just in normal stuff, normal coding that I do. And the key that I found is that Copilot, and there is I know a version of it for business, and they need to be very thoughtful, and they are being thoughtful around like sharing code and things of that sort. So the key here is it's not just going to read it just because the project exists. You need to open those tabs up. And if you open those tabs up, my experience is it will read that, it'll take it into context, and can be a big help. Kevin?
So my experience with that was when I was trying to learn some Kotlin. I was doing a Udemy course on it, and I downloaded the sample code from the Udemy course, opened up a lot of the tabs, and Copilot was instantly able to help me complete the task. So it was almost like cheating for the Udemy course. It had the almost to the word exact code that the instructor was looking for in the course. So I would say yes, it can absolutely read and take the context from that code in an existing project.
Perfect. We have time for one more question. And so what was your experience with Copilot generating secure code? While GitHub claims they curate and filter out insecure code, I have seen it suggest insecure code. Looking to see this get better over time.
Yeah, I would say my quick answer to that is off the cuff in like this really simple app. I didn't see it generate insecure code. And we also did not see that in the static only scans that we did or the dynamic scans. But at the same time, it did generate code, for example, for the Firestore for me that was the wrong code. And so as I kind of put on my developer hat, you've got like security issues, you've got performance issues, you've got, things don't compile, obviously things of that sort. So one, no, didn't see it generate any. Two, I think it certainly is possible. I know in the early days, I would see Copilot generate things like SQL injections, and that is a particular pattern that I know they've focused on, and I'm pretty sure has been addressed. So my expectation would be that over time, that code will get better. I think there's always the chance, as these large language models pull from the publicly available code, and of course do their statistical analysis and what's next, that certainly can happen, especially in mobile when you think about how complex it is with third-party libraries. because the interaction between the code you write and those libraries is really complicated. And that's not something that you just detect statically. It has to be done dynamically. So Chris, my take on that is I think it certainly is possible. I do think GitHub is focused on and trying to kind of address the low hanging fruit. But I do think that software is very complex and that possibility always exists. Obviously, that's why we did the security scanning on all the pull requests and merges. Kevin, anything to add to that?
I didn't actually see any insecure code generated by GitHub, by Copilot, but I did have an incident where I caused an issue where I was reading my API docs and all the samples in the API docs used HTTP for network communications. So I copied that and pasted it into my code, and Android Studio picked that up by default because I hadn't declared in my manifest clear text communications were allowed. So the only security issue that happened during my project was created by me, the developer, not by Copilot.
Awesome.
Awesome.
So that concludes our June Tech Talk. Before we end here today, I did want to make a few quick announcements. So as mentioned, these Tech Talks happen every month. And I want to let you know about July's Tech Talk, which will feature Jason from MITRE, who will be presenting on the most recent updates to the MITRE attack framework. It'll be a more security-oriented session, but you will get to learn some really great best practices for securing mobile. We also have a couple of resources here I'd like to highlight, especially our recently revamped NowSecure Academy. If you have not been to our academy, I really encourage you to explore. There are dozens of free online courses available to you that will help you upskill at your own pace. So introductory courses for secure mobile app development, reverse engineering, and open source tools like Frida that are really popular for both developer and security professionals alike. So you can also find the recordings of past Tech Talks on there. And the best part is it's all free to sign up. We also have other helpful articles and reports in our resources center, so I invite you to check those out as well. And with that, thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again next month. Cheers.